Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the new offices of FPRI. Those of you who are here with us as the live audience, and those of you who are tuning in on Zoom for this FPRI special event on national security challenges facing the United States. This is a co-production of FPRI and the United States Army War College Eisenhower Series College Program. I'm Ron Granarian of FPRI and the Army War College, and I'm delighted that you're all here with us today. The United States Army War College was founded in Washington in 1901 and now is located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. In the words of its founding spirit, Secretary of War Elihu Root, its purpose was not to promote war, but to preserve peace by intelligence and adequate preparation to repel aggression. Today, the War College provides both a residential and a distance program that offers a Master of Strategic Studies to select senior military and civilian leaders from the United States and allied nations who already have about 20 years of experience within the armed forces or within national security. Their diverse courses of study help prepare them for the next level responsibility as senior leaders within their armed forces, their countries, national security establishment. For more than 50 years, the United States Army War College's Eisenhower Series College Program has been designed to encourage candid dialogue on national security and other policy issues between War College students and the broader public. An elective program born out of the experience of the Vietnam conflict and its impact on the War College's hometown of Carlisle. ESCP students now travel across the country, speaking to college classes, voluntary organizations, think tanks, and other public forums. Today, FPRI is pleased to welcome 3 representatives of the Eisenhower Series College Program to present their ideas and engage in just such a dialogue. Our topic is national security challenges facing the United States. Over the past few years, U.S. strategy has undergone a serious reconsideration. In both formal statements and general outlook, American leaders have moved away from a focus on terrorism and violent extremism toward a renewed interest in great power competition with near-peer competitors, especially China and Russia, a rethinking that has intensified, to say the least, over the past year, thanks to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Immediate challenges require immediate responses, but strategic rebalance requires careful rethinking by strategic leaders who will work within the new environment and by the society those leaders represent. So our guests today, who are all members of the United States Army War College class of 2023, offer examples of that rethinking. They should not be considered necessarily subject matter experts on the topics at hand, although they have certainly worked themselves into them. Rather, they provide an informed military practitioner's perspective on the subject that is rooted in their experience of connecting the strategic to the tactical. We value dialogue here. And so after I introduce our 3 speakers, after they have offered brief presentations, we will be open to your questions, both for the folks who are here in the room and those of you who are online. So get those questions ready. I'm going to introduce our 3 speakers first. Starting at my far left, Brigadier General Bhat has served in the Army of India for 30 years and is one of 77 distinguished international fellows attending the United States Army War College this year. He has held various assignments, including command of an infantry company during counterinsurgency operations in Kashmir, and has held senior command positions of large units that operate armored vehicles such as tanks, including as a deputy commander of an armored brigade at extreme high altitude in the Himalayas, which is a story all for itself, I'm sure. An electronics engineer, he belongs to the northern Kashmir province of India and has traveled widely across his country. Second, Lieutenant Colonel Joe England is an Army intelligence officer from Texas, with over 20 years in the U.S. Army and in the Army Reserve. He has held strategic-level intelligence assignments in Japan, Korea, and Iraq. As a civilian, he worked at a Big Four strategy consulting firm, and most recently, as the National Vice President of Sales for a digital health company. Lieutenant Colonel England has an MBA from Baylor, and as a TCU alum, loves watching the Horned Frogs win. I guess you also probably tolerate the occasional win by the Baylor Bears when necessary. Finally, Lieutenant Colonel Chris Powers is a military police officer with over 23 years of service in the Missouri National Guard. He has supported Homeland Security operations following the 9/11 attacks, deployed to Iraq, trained units in Panama and Poland, responded to numerous state emergencies ranging from natural disasters to civil unrest. When not in uniform, Chris serves as the managing member of a law firm that specializes in real estate litigation and operates a beef cattle farm, which I'm going to talk about as well. So before I start with the presentations with General Bhat, I want to offer the formal disclaimer, and that this applies to the three speakers and to your moderator, that you understand that the opinions that we express here are our own and do not necessarily represent the official position of the Department of Defense, the United States Army, the United States War College, or the government of India. Forward to the conversation. But first, I'm going to turn the floor over to General Bhat.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On 15th of June, 2020, Indian and Chinese soldiers faced off with each other at an altitude of 15,500 feet, high up in the Kailash ranges, north of the Greater Himalayas. This face-off quickly deteriorated into a fight with bare hands, sticks, and clubs, because the treaty between the two nations forbids both of them to carry weapons. This led to death of scores of soldiers on both sides and hundreds of injured ones. Now, I happen to have been posted in the same place. I was deployed in the same place till about 7 months before this incident took place, and I'm privy to many such incidents in the past which have been happening all along, except for the fact that this one really deteriorated into a bad situation where people fought with each other and got killed. But the bottom line is that India and China, the relations between the two countries have taken a turn for the worse, especially over the last about 10 to 12 odd years. Now, given the hostilities which are happening between the two countries, it would seem natural for India to be aligning with the United States and its great power competition with China. But for that to happen, there are certain things that we need to consider, and I have kind of simplified those into three factors which need to be looked into before India and the US can really take a call as to where are they going to take their relationship to the next level, or is it going to stay static. The first and foremost is the understanding of the risk and reward balance for the policymakers in India. So in terms of risk, what is the risk that if India turns more towards the West? Obviously, it's further aggravation with China. India and China have been neighbors. They are neighbors. Two of the most populous countries in the world share a 2,200-mile-long border, have fought a bloody war in the past in 1962, and really cannot afford to further conflagrate the situation at the border between the two countries. But the actions of China speak otherwise. And India has to remain allied to the security situation on its border. Also, these two countries, besides being the two most populous countries in the world, accounting for 40% of the population between the two of them of the whole world, they also are the biggest trading partners. India and China and the US, and India has the biggest trade with either China or US for the past 7 years, one or two. So further deteriorating relations with China also can have a great impact on the economic ties or the economic situation in South Asia and Southeast Asia and East Asia. And on the other hand, and I'm talking the reward factor now. In case India decides to align further with the West, it's going to give India a great amount of assurance, a great amount of insurance against Chinese adventurism in the region. Now, this is the risk and reward factor that India has to consider to further decide as to which way it's going to pivot. The second aspect is India's historical pacifism. India has never invaded a country in its entire history. India has never been a part of any military alliance in the past. India was the forerunner of the non-aligned movement in the 20th century, which slowly, as the century turned into the 21st century, has translated into a stated policy of strategic autonomy, which in layman terms means that we will do what we feel is correct for ourselves without prejudice or bias towards any other party. And it has translated into India trying to stay equidistant from both China as well as the United States and the West. But how this is going to pan out in the future will again depend upon how much is the risk and how much is the reward that we perceive, that India perceives from the first point that I spoke about just before this. And the last and one of the, I think the most important point is India's kind of mistrust with respect to the United States that is born out of certain historical events and some historical reasons. And these go back to, right from the Nixon times to the turn of the century when the U.S. decided to draw a little closer to India after decades of staying aloof. But then it got covered up by the developing global war on terror in the decade of the 2000s, which led to U.S. again distancing itself from India because it was relying upon Pakistan to fight this war in Afghanistan, and it could really possibly not have afforded to have closer relationship with India, given that it was dependent on Pakistan for so much. So having said all this, I would quickly summarize the saying that what's the dilemma in front of us? The dilemma in front of India is that we would ideally like to be strategically autonomous. We would ideally want to stay equidistant from both U.S. and China, but the developing situation in the region does not really permit for us to be following this policy of strategic autonomy for a longer run. And therefore, we need to figure out these three factors that I mentioned, and we need to figure out for ourselves as to how we are going to recalibrate our strategic position, how we're going to pivot away from our equidistant policy or a strategic autonomic policy towards a more nuanced kind of cooperation in terms of especially the military cooperation with the United States and the West. And I would be happy to take on any questions on this particular matter, including any issues related with Sino-India relationship, Sino-US relationship, or the linkages between the two of them. Thank you.
Thank you, General Bhat. So I'm going to have each of the speakers give their presentations, then we will have questions, but I hope that you will, I hope that you've already got us going here thinking about one important strategic triangle in the region, or I guess if you include the Pakistanis, a strategic quadrilateral, which makes things even more complicated. But I want to go to Lieutenant Colonel England.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dr. Brigader. Pleasure to be with everybody today. Thanks for hosting us. So a big topic of my focus this year is really the tensions that we're seeing play out between China and Taiwan. Across the greater Indo-Pacific theater and rim, it's but one flashpoint, but certainly one that has been making headlines for a variety of reasons. But when we look at the strategic importance of that region, not only for countries and our allies and partners in that region, but the security implications that region has back here in the United States, they're enormous. In the very recent past, the company I was at, I was part of a decision to onshore assembly operations from Taiwan to California, and that drove our cost of goods and our manufacturing costs way higher than what they were before. But we felt that it was strategically necessary, not necessarily only in the event some hostile action could unfold between China and Taiwan, but just to secure a long-term redundant access to our inventories. As I really started to research this year, many are familiar with the economic importance in that region. 60% of the world's hydrocarbons flow through the South China Sea. Economically, we know that Taiwan produces 92% of the world's most advanced semiconductors, so those that are less than 10 nanometers in size. Wonderful read that reinforces that and kind of the soft war or competition, if you will, that we see between China and Taiwan and the United States as it relates to semiconductors is Chris Miller's Chip War. Wonderful book. And delving into that, he really kind of calls out that soft competition that we're seeing today. He recently actually spoke to us at the War College. Today's also a momentous day. Today is the first day that foreign and domestic organizations can apply for subsidies as part of the CHIPS Act, supported by allies and partners through multilateral institutions like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. So we're excited to see who throws their name in the hat. Maybe that's Intel or Samsung Semiconductor, or maybe other foreign organizations that are already establishing redundant operations here. So that's really the topic of my research, and one that I think has got a myriad of implications around what ultimately does or does not happen with Taiwan, which allies and partners in the region get involved or don't get involved. And I think there's actually a lot of interesting parallels even around negotiations, potential silver linings, and even things that we're seeing unfold in Russia and Ukraine. happy to engage in any dialogue or questions on it. Thank you.
Senator Crow Powers.
Thank you, Doctor. So it's great to be with you all in Philadelphia. It's great to visit here again. I will disclose up front, I'm a Kansas City Chiefs person right outside of the metropolitan area. So I know there's a potential for combat, but as General Bhat mentioned, very well trained in clubs and stick technology. So
We issued you a safe passage.
I sense the buffer here. Yeah. So as my colleagues are really discussing really global and regional issues abroad, as a National Guardsman, I'm focused a little bit more domestically with the topics that I'm studying. So just a little bit more background into the War College. Part of our core curriculum is to study theory of war and strategy, campaigning, national security policy, and these sorts of things. And so as we've developed research projects, obviously the big things in the news meter what are driving a lot of our studies. Having dealt with the real estate industry back here, practicing law in the state of Missouri and throughout the Midwest, we're seeing a little bit of a nuanced national security issue, and that is in the realm of just real estate ownership generally, and some of the implications that foreign investment in the United States real estate could have as an aggregate in the United States. So just to kind of really briefly highlight three different categories that I'm researching as part of my project. The first category has to do with acquisitions of large swaths of agricultural land. You're starting to see, certainly with Congress people in the Midwest, there's really a heightening of alert on the divestiture of those assets to foreign entities, and really a lack of understanding of where those entities are coming from and where they're investing from. So just looking at self-reporting alone under the United States Department of Agriculture's disclosure regulations, we know that foreign owners own approximately 40 million acres of agricultural land and lease about another 83 million. And some of these are 99-year leases. So you add all those land holdings together, we're talking about enough land, just contextually, that would cover the states of New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Ohio, and Indiana. And so if you lift those agricultural assets out of the United States, we can naturally see some of the perils that might come as a consequence to those issues. And so that's the first sort of area that I'm looking into. The second area that we're looking into has to do with really land acquisition around key infrastructure. And so we're seeing the Chinese Communist Party buy up really significant infrastructural assets throughout Latin America, ports, railroad systems, and even installing their own to some degree. And we're also seeing these sorts of acquisitions occur in the United States, not so much on security infrastructure, but from an operational security perspective, land that surrounds our military apparatuses. So you might have seen recent reports up in North Dakota where some of our very sensitive aerial surveillance technology is housed. The acquisitional land just right off of the post, and the concern of espionage by the entity that owns that land. The same is true for Del Rio, Texas, with Laughlin Air Base, 150,000 acres that essentially surrounds that air base by a party that has direct ties to the Chinese Communist Party. That's where our Air Force training occurs. It's very easy to monitor incoming and outgoing air traffic control from the national security perspective. And so there are some natural national security elements or impacts to that. You know, when a lot of our national infrastructure from the defense side, started right around the World Wars. And so there really wasn't this consideration of this sort of technology being utilized on these facilities. And so now that we're becoming more vulnerable from the satellite-based and the cybersecurity sorts of frameworks, this is really an impactful concern that's being raised with our local Congress people. The third and final area that we're looking at too are land use norms. And I know we have one or two other attorneys in the room. Typically, obviously there's a difference of opinion when it comes to investment with foreign ownership. And there's a real concern about immediate return on investment and shoring up immediate profit. And so as a consequence of that, we're seeing natural resource depletion out west with water resourcing. We're also seeing foreign capital control laws being imposed on United States investors that could have a really detrimental effect. The big key item, I guess the glaring example of this was the Chinese Communist Party's essentially foreclosure of the Chinese investment firms' land holding in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. here in 2018. So in essence, that property is now titled in the Chinese Communist Party. And some of these things are occurring below the radar, and I think it cause some broader public concern. And so that's kind of the reason that I'm looking into these particular areas. And again, like my colleagues, very excited to field any questions that you might have.
As you see, ladies and gentlemen, right, we talk about national security strategy, national security challenges, right? They range from the direct sort of classical national security challenges of borders and access to land, but also to economic questions. And so I hope that we'll be able to move in a lot of different directions with the questions. I'm going to, for the only time today, I promise, invoke the chair's privilege, and I want to ask the first question. I want to ask you, General Bhat, about the question of, you talk about how India needs to rethink some of its strategic autonomy. But clearly, right, the Indians think the way they think about the United States in part because of things the United States has done. And so this raises the question of who needs to move first in order to improve the relationship between them.
That's a very interesting question, but I will give a quick answer to the question and then give an explanation. I think both need to move together.
Yeah.
There cannot be the first mover in this particular case. And having said that, I think the historical baggage of the past till from the 70s till about 2000s, and then the interest of the Clinton administration with India. And of course, later on with the Bush administration because of the 9/11 events and the engagement of the United States in Afghanistan, which got extended to nearly about 20 years. Now that really kind of relegated the engagement which had begun during the Clinton administration. It relegated the engagement between India and United States to the background for a good amount of years. But then of late, ever since the U.S. had decided to exit Afghanistan, and then it formally exited Afghanistan a couple of years back, I think the relations between the two countries have actually taken a reset. And there's a lot more amount of engagement, lot more amount of trust between the two countries. You see a lot of even military kind of trade happening between the two countries. India has purchased a lot of United States equipment. India was already purchasing French equipment in the past. And these are the two Western countries from which India does import its defense equipment. Though India still remains reliant on Russia. About 65 to 70% of the Indian inventory is still Russian, but there has been a definite shift in recent years, and India genuinely wants to wean away from Russian equipment for a variety of reasons. I won't go into those. It's also got to link to the future technological threshold of Russian equipment vis-a-vis the Western equipment. It's also got linked to the fact that Russia is a declining power or a declined power, if I may say so. And it may really not be beneficial of India to remain glued to Russia, but there are problems with respect to life cycle requirements of equipment inventory. You purchase an equipment, the life cycle is 50 years, so you can't suddenly decouple today. I mean, if I decide to decouple from Russia, I can't do it today. So these are the challenges with India. But yes, I think India on its part has put it away, the historical mistrust or the bad experience I spoke about. I think it's put it away. Even in the public discourse, in the narrative which goes along in the country, it's a democratic country, so you get a lot of media and a lot of people, kind of talk. So that kind of animosity towards the United States in general public opinion is no longer. I think it's reduced to a great extent. And Indian people as a people would like to engage more with the United States. Incidentally, the largest amount of student community which comes to the United States from foreign countries has recently shifted from China to India. Last 2 years, it's Indian students who are the maximum which have come to the United States. So these are the kind of engagements between the two nations which bode a very bright future. And I'm of the view that this relationship, it has taken an excellent start, and nothing greater than the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan at a time Because if US had continued to stay in Afghanistan for some more years, India would still have remained tentative because of the Pakistan angle, right? So all that has changed, and I think it calls for a very bright engagement in the years to come.
That's a diplomatic answer. When you were Lieutenant Bhat, were you training in armor? Were you training in Soviet tanks?
Yes,
Yeah.
I have commanded a Soviet T-72 regiment. I have commanded a T-90 brigade. But as I said, it's because of the I can't really speak for sure, but I'm absolutely sure that the next Indian tank is not going to be Russian. I can say that as a senior armored corps officer, the next Indian tank is not going to be Russian.
Fair enough. Thank you, Sir Bhat. A question that came in very early from our online audience, just so that you. Oh, the mic, yeah. We have a question about the issue of computer chips, and Joe specifically mentioned it, and you mentioned, of course, Chris Miller, a favorite son of FPRI, right? So one of the directors of our Eurasia program, and the question of how should the United States imagine, in terms of forward planning and strategic interest in Taiwan, about the computer chip production. There's a two-sided part of this, right? Jeffrey Allen asked a question about how we should think about the defense of Taiwan and the defense of that access to. But there is also the question that hangs over this is, was it ever a good strategic idea to make sure that the most important thing in our entire economy was constructed within 100 miles of the shores of our greatest adversary? And what can we do about that?
Thank you for that question, sir.
You knew you were going to get it.
Absolutely, I appreciate it. Yeah, I think that a lot of things have come to light in the last even just handful of years. You can take a lot of things. There was a great question just the other day around onset of COVID-19 and what supply chains, medical resources, prescription drugs are needed, and how do we get those and make sure we've shored up our resiliency internally here at home to deal with those types of emerging challenges. As it relates to chips specifically, yeah, that's another really good question. I think the general basic economist and undergrad would understand there are comparative advantages to relying on skilled and efficient labor in various locations that provide upside to help maximize revenues, and that's kind of what the business had on. And Taiwan, certainly, especially when you look at their leading organizations like Taiwan Semiconductor and their increasing involvement with the United States, to include the establishment of a new facility in North Phoenix, presents a wide array of advantages for us. I think, and I mentioned the CHIPS Act earlier, but I definitely think that ensuring there are redundancies that we have, not only from a national defense perspective, but even individual businesses as well. I mentioned an impact a former business of mine went through. We needed to take a close look at where our operations were, what that operational footprint looked like, and not only how to secure it physically, but having some redundancy, or at least plans for redundancy, and across multiple sectors is always beneficial.
And I guess that comes down to the idea, is the goal of the CHIP Act to move chip production more towards the United States? Or, and I guess this is as a strategic matter, how does one both help to protect the Taiwanese and also encourage a repositioning of chip production? Or can you do both?
Absolutely. I'd like to think and offer that maybe one supports the other. Mm-hmm. So kind of breaking that question into two parts. The first part being, this idea that we have around integrated deterrence in general. Our national policymakers look at a variety of what we call national instruments. We study these at the War College as well. So there are large scale, obviously military posturing and what we call the big N in a series of letters in an acronym called DIME, which stands for Diplomatic, Informational, Military, and Economic. And we've been employing that from a deterrent posture in Taiwan today. So this is $14 billion in funding. Some of that got put on hold so we could redirect some of that to the conflict in Ukraine. But then also as a deterrent measure, putting in the new National Defense Authorization Act, the $10 billion allotment being delivered in $2 billion installments for the next 5 years into the self-defense of Taiwan. And that comes in the form of air defense missile capabilities and training, and defensive arms, which relates back to the Taiwan 79. So there's definitely a military component, but then there are diplomatic measures we can take as well. And I would offer, in the second part of that question, that creating some redundancies and spreading the footprint of who we are reliant on for capability, and for critical technologies such as semiconductors and advanced semiconductors. And this includes from TSMC themselves, who may very well likely apply for their own subsidy as part of the CHIPS Act. It is good. It provides some redundancy. I think ultimately the interesting thing it does is it may change China's decision calculus, not only from a military perspective on is it smart or not smart to invade Taiwan. And when I say invade, that can look like a variety of different things. It could be a blockade, which they effectively executed in last August during the third Taiwan Strait crisis. I mean, it caused the rerouting and enhanced costs of shipping insurance for multiple ships trying to get into Kaohsiung in the southern port or up to Taipei. And so by us looking at how we can diversify and have redundant access to different supply chains, it may show China that we are less reliant on just one prized possession. It's not as much at risk, and perhaps there's some hope in their new charm offensive that reinforces the idea of a peaceful reunification with China, with Taiwan, between China and Taiwan.
Back to Taiwan, I understand from what I've read, my knowledge is obviously quite limited. I understand the importance of the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, CHIPS. But recently, in an article in Foreign Affairs, I read to suggest that, or the author, whose name I can't remember, seemed to suggest that from a strategic standpoint, it would be a disaster if the Chinese controlled Taiwan because it gives them access to the immediate access to the Western Pacific. They break that island chain now, and they have access to the Western Pacific. And also, which I think about, that they could locate certain types of equipment that would be able to monitor our shipping, military shipping in the Western Pacific. And then, so could you just elaborate a little on, the strategic significance to us of Taiwan, whether or not it would be a disaster if we lost Taiwan? And number two is, I also always read that the credibility of the United States is significant. Is that a major factor in terms of our response to presentation of Taiwan?
Absolutely. So again, kind of two parts. First, losing Taiwan, and by losing Taiwan, meaning China invading Taiwan or blockading Taiwan or cutting it off, or even reunifying with Taiwan at some point, if that were to happen point in time today, we would be economically interdependent, more so than we are today, obviously, with China, and a reunified China, because they would ostensibly have a unification that includes business operations in Taiwan. And China already owns about 10% of TSMC and growing. So there are also some interesting financial equity considerations there as well. I think from a tactical standpoint, China has increased operations throughout the first island chain, the second island chain, and we've seen this over multiple years with militarization of islands in the Spratlys in the South China Sea, and looking at where they conduct maritime air operations. During this last Taiwan Strait crisis, they have shown a willingness not only to resort to military force as a sort of their own deterrent, maybe bullying, you could say, but it was the first time that so many incursions into Taiwan's air defense identifications that have happened. It's also the first time they fired ballistic missiles over the island of Taiwan to the eastern shore of Taiwan. So I think they are already, you could say, flexing a little bit of muscle and presence throughout that region. They're, from an ISR perspective, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and just intelligence oversight standpoint, I would offer that we have tremendous capability. I would also offer China has tremendous capability. And it helps them to establish footprints, and it enhances their maneuverability. So I don't know if Taiwan by itself creates a huge amount of challenge for the United States if we were to lose Taiwan. In fact, the Center for Strategic and International Studies recently did a war game. I'm sure many people have seen it. The losses were, it was a little aggressive. But when we looked at that, one of the things they highlighted was, the eastern flank of Taiwan is terrible for supporting longshore logistics chains. You really cannot land on that side of Taiwan. And that's the side of Taiwan that we would be approaching from should there be a long, slow float towards Taiwan and we were engaged in some sort of kinetic or military conflict. So while I definitely think it's significant, I don't know that it is solely critical for what would happen. And then you also see us bolstering the fact that, hey, if something happens, we're going to take proper precautions in advance. And we see that now with allies and partners. So the new rotational basing agreement, the new construction in the northern part of the Philippines in Luzon, we are establishing a multifaceted footprint with multiple locations that gives us access facing overflight rights, that gives us rotational agreement rights, where we can take kind of more of a deterrent posture in the region to help China from taking hostile action.
So I've got a bunch of questions. Bob, I'm going to take your question, and then I want to throw one to Chris. But go ahead, Bob.
I wanted to ask Lieutenant Colonel about land.
Yes, sir.
Good, that's what I was going to
In Iowa, and when I grew up, it was 168 quarter section. Then by the time I graduated from high school, it was a section. Okay, now it's even more farms. I have an uncle with a 2,500 acre farm, and that's not a big deal. It used to be a huge deal. So I believe both political parties are rooting this from a standpoint, because neither one of them can propose a solution. I've heard Tom Vilsack on radio talk about what the U.S. should do, establishing some kind of a national land use policy. What are your comments on that national land use policy? Is it even possible that it could be done? I think it's terribly important.
And just to clarify, Bob, this is even dealing with sort of the U.S. owners and
Absolutely.
Just in general, should we be
Absolutely,
thinking about
because it's a whole free-for-all, and we're losing land, I think, a very inappropriate manner. Anyway, comments?
Yeah, so there's a lot there. I think the Iowa State Legislature last year enacted legislation that foreign ownership of agricultural land is capped at like 5 acres or something super small. And so the concern with that is that we're not having a national sort of approach in dealing with international affairs, international commerce, and there are some constitutional implications of that. The states are arguing essentially a 10th Amendment argument that is essentially powers that aren't specified to the federal government are left to the states.
Right.
Land tenure being one of those because there's not an enumeration within the Constitution of that. And so that's the constitutional issues between the state and federal government that are ongoing and suspending really a national effort going forward. My proposal, I think, is twofold. Number one, we need to utilize the current authorities. We do have a couple of authorities. We need to kind of rethink about how we utilize those. I'll give you a couple of examples. The first one is the Foreign Disclosure Act. Under the Foreign Disclosure Act, the United States Department of Agriculture is supposed to mandate that foreign entities report their land holdings to them. The issue about that is that there are no punitive mechanisms should a foreign entity decide not to disclose or to fraudulently disclose by hiding their corporate members. I bring this visual aid because the undergrads we talk to are always interested in it. They're concerned that I'm going to get wheeled out of here by the local sheriff. But this is a letter I got from the United States Department of Agriculture last year when I bought 60 acres of farmland just down the road. And they basically said, hey, we see that there's been a change in ownership. We need to know who your corporate body is made of, who the individual entity members are, and reply back to us within 30 days. Coming to War College just about a month earlier and deciding that this was going to be my research topic, I very quickly ascertained that there's no way for them to compel me, them being the United States Department of Agriculture, to disclose. And so I was looking for what the mechanism there was, and there isn't one. And so that's number one. You see certain national legislators saying that right now. We think this is what foreign entities own, but we really don't know because we don't have a punitive mechanism. But beyond that, beyond the legislation, in the 1950 Defense Production Act was amended in 1991 when this technology revolution started. And it authorizes a committee of federal executives to essentially come together when there's an acquisition of a company that has a national security component to it. So the easiest example was the attempted purchase of a German chip manufacturing firm that was housed in the United States that just so happened to be manufacturing chips that went into our Patriot missile system. So this organization, the Committee on Foreign Investment, they got together as the authorization provided, and they suggested, look, this is something that the president needs to block on national security grounds. My position is that if the infrastructure and those sorts of components are eligible for that sort of protection, so should our food security. And so I think that the act already authorizes that, but the committee members, there's no representative from the United States Department of Agriculture, there's not a representative from the Department of Treasury. I think we need to reinvigorate what that committee's made of, and we need to rethink about national security from a food security perspective. So I think that's at least an interim approach until we can get the federal legislators together to directly enable legislation.
The issue just hasn't caught.
I think it's growing though. At least certainly in the Midwest, it's something becoming much more common.
There are a bunch of angles on your paper, your presentation, Chris, and I'd like to pick up on in addition to this, but I'll throw out two and then we'll move on. One is the question of I don't want to insult anybody in either North Dakota or Del Rio, Texas, but I doubt very much the Chinese are buying all that land because of its beautiful location to live in, right? And so there is that issue of, how can or how should a state like the United States or any of our allies and partners who embrace the workings of the market, is where does the market have to be restricted? And how do you do that, especially if one of our criticisms of the Chinese is that their economy is completely controlled by them? So that's one question.
Sure.
And I think that's not just for you, but that's for Joe. Then related to that is, you talked about the amount of agricultural land that may or may not be owned or leased by foreign entities. The funny thing about land is you can own it, but you can't take it home with you. Mm-hmm. And so and this is a fortiori true of the stuff that's produced on the land. So let's say the PLA might own a bunch of land. Heck, they might own a bunch of land in Tanzania where they're growing grain, but they somehow have to harvest that grain and put it on a ship and take it back. So there's the question of, are there any, outside of just the fact that there's a lot of steps in there that could be interdicted, is there any way to think about the use of land that either the individual states or the federal government has a way to make sure that stuff can't be produced there and transported someplace we don't want?
So there's a lot there.
I'm sorry. We only have another hour.
That's right. Just set back and relax. So a couple of things. You're exactly right. The key counter argument to any sort of legislation is we are an open, free economy, right? And it should be up to anyone to sell their property to whoever they want. So that's one issue. The other, more visceral sort of reaction to this sort of legislation was just looking back in history and what we did to the Japanese and in turning and divesting them of their land interests at the beginning of the 20th century because they couldn't be trusted to own land in California. And that law was upheld all the way up to the United States Supreme Court back then. And so those are the two real big counter narratives that are with this. So on the other side of it, with regard to like buffer zones around defense facilities, we already have the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment provides, that we can essentially condemn land for the purposes of a public use. And so I think that certainly as we evolve our defense infrastructure, that's something that we need to look at beyond just the mere physical location of property. So I think there are some mechanisms in place to limit that sort of activity. But the other side of it is that by the time you get that litigation through the system, you're looking 3 to 5 years down the road, and that adversary has done what they wanted to do by then. So there are some issues that relate to that. Your second question, give me the kind of the three.
What do we do a foreign entity can buy agricultural land?
Yeah.
But what can they do with the is there anything to be done to limit what they do with the agricultural result?
Let me I'll elevate that question just a little bit. I've had panelists and other people speak with me on this topic, and they'll often say, well, look, if something were to really happen, we could divest them of that property and we could go back in and farm it. The issue is that the U.S. ag industry is already having a really we've met demand for decades upon decades, but what you see is an extreme increase in costs and an aging farming demographic. And so that if you stall out and you essentially allow this divestiture to occur for a period of 10, 20 years, all of a sudden there's not the support, even if we wanted to retake it. So looking at your question more specifically, I was thinking about when you asked, or when the question came about, Joe, about the chip manufacturing being absorbed by the Chinese Communist Party. There has to be some relation. We have to have a market where those chips are purchased. And so there is some mutual dependency between China and the United States. The same is true for ag product. And so right now, the Chinese, they essentially import 20% of their agricultural product each year into China from directly in the United States. And so I think there is at least a market mechanism to fix that sort of a concern. I don't know if that hits precisely the issue, but that would be my question.
That's all right. There are several questions for General Bhat that have come in online, and I want to try to combine a few of them because there's a theme in here is the relationship between India and China. Sort of, if the United States certainly has an interest in encouraging the Indians to see the Chinese as a bigger problem than the United States, because then we can be friends. But the question is, what exactly are the Indians and the Chinese fighting? Has it changed over time, right? Have we moved from a specific disagreement about the border in the Himalayas to something larger and regional? And if that is indeed a change of, based on a change of perspective by the Chinese and even by the Indians, that the two states are looking at each other differently, is there a way that also could mean that the Chinese and the Indians could find a way to resolution that is different? So if it was all focused on, I want the border to be here and I want the border to be there, that's one set of problems. If it's something different, does that change the Sino-Indian dynamic, and what does that mean then for Washington? And then related to that, Britt Heinsohn asked the question, right? Put aside your armor experience and say, where should India place its military investments and think about its military posture if it's not just about the border and the Himalayas anymore? Does this mean India needs to spend more on its Navy? Does India need to spend more on its air defense to rethink India's position?
So I'll take it one at a time. So I would like to delve a little bit into history of Sino-Indian relations. Around the time that both countries became countries, 1947 for India and 49 for PRC, we started off with a great amount of bonhoming because we felt that we were the harbingers of change in the world, because these were two great nations, two of the amongst the most populated nations in the world at that time. However, the first signs of cracks started happening when China quietly, even as we had signed a mutual treaty of friendship and cooperation in 1954, even as that treaty was being signed, there was a lot of bonhoming between the two countries, between the people of the two countries, a lot of cultural exchange and all that. China quietly started building a road through Aksai Chin, which is Tibet. This Aksai Chin was part of the Jammu and Kashmir province of India. And the realization of this came to India 3 years later, by which time the road had been completed. And when this realization came, suddenly there was a total reset of the ties between the two countries, because the Prime Minister of India, Nehru, he tried to engage the Chinese in a dialogue to get this thing sorted out, but the Chinese just about kind of gave a thumbs down. They were refusing to talk on this. And within 5 years, India and China fought a bitter, bloody war in which Indian army was badly bruised, beaten, because we had not developed, we had no equipment, we were not prepared for this kind of a war. But then I think that war was a wake-up call for India, and the Indian army after that transformed itself from a very, very underdeveloped force to a developing force. India sought out the United States at that point in time but did not get a response post President Kennedy. President Kennedy was very inclined towards aligning with India. Unfortunately, he died, and the subsequent presidents were more inclined towards aligning with Pakistan, and that was the result of that was the reason for India moving towards the Russians, and that further aggravated the situation between India and China, because China and Russia were not exactly great friends at that point in time. Now, till about 1987, there was a lot of engagement between India and China to resolve the enduring territorial issue, where China wanted India to accept Aksai-Chin as part of China, in return for which China said that they would accept, and this was a red herring they put in. They said the eastern borders of India, the Arunachal Pradesh border, they said that historically that also belongs to China, whereas the control of that place had always been with India. So the other side of the border, which is a very long border, like the Ladakh border towards the west, which I'm talking about, that's Aksai-Chin border. The other border they lay claim on, and they put in a clause that, okay, we'll give you that one, but you recognize Aksai-Chin to be part of ours, whereas both had always been ours, as laid down by the Britishers during their time. And there was a treaty signed between the three parties, that is India, Tibet, and China in 1914. I mean, British India. So it stayed on till then. And now, looking in hindsight, I feel that by 87, when China was okay to sign a border treaty with India, possibly if India had gone ahead with that, maybe the border issue would have been resolved, because China has resolved land border issues with all the other 13 neighboring countries, less India. And China was keen to have resolved this thing, but India was reluctant at that point in time, because the result would not have been bought by the Indian public. They would have just not accepted Aksai-Chin going to China. After 87, there was a shift. There was a complete shift. China took on, with the huge amount of assistance of the United States, the Chinese economy started galloping. India was still in the socialist era, and India thought that it would be, and India continued to try and find a resolution to the border conflict. So India had a series of talks leading with the then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi going to China. It ended in 3 rounds of talks, and to 93, 96, and 2005 border agreements. But China refrained from delineating the border. Now China's stand had changed. They said nothing doing. Arunachal Pradesh, the eastern border is also ours, and Aksai-Chin is also ours, and we will continue to manage it. The word they used is manage it. And India, for the last 25 years, continued to push for a solution, not realizing that China had changed its mind. China was becoming stronger. It started its economic liberalization earlier, and China was wanting to keep this border issue as a handle to control India. And that's where it stands today. India has also now realized that it's not only about territory. It's not about territorial gains in those desolate lands, 15,000, 16,000 feet, a few kilometers here and there. It doesn't really matter, really speaking, for both India and China. Certainly for China. But it's about having the control over India, causing distress in India by fabricating, by creating these criticalities in those high altitude regions, by forcing the Indian government to go on the defensive. So that is the kind of approach that China has adopted, and I think now Indian understanding is also evolved in keeping with what how the Chinese think about the whole thing. And to the related question as to the relationship between India and the U.S. vis-a-vis that of China, I mean, there's no comparison. There's just no comparison. India and China are stated enemies. The government of India has pronounced China as the #1 enemy. Pakistan has faded into the background. I mean, the Indian economy has grown so fast over the past 20 years that Pakistan is kind of nowhere. Pakistan is no longer a part of the Indian narrative. It's all about China. And as I said, as the country gets farther away from China, it naturally grows closer to the United States. It's a matter of historic, policy that India has been repeatedly, talking about strategic autonomy. But I think the actions of India it definitely point a way where India is moving closer towards the West, and especially the United States. That's the answer to the first question. And the second was about military investments and military posting if we discount the borders. If you discount the borders, India has been I mentioned earlier, India is a pacifist country, has never invaded, has never doesn't have an expeditionary army, always had a brown water navy, but it's the navy that India is focusing on because it wants to have a definite control, at least over the Indian Ocean region, if not across the three straits in South China Sea. And it is already wary of, cautious of the rising Chinese influence in Indian Ocean, the littorals of Indian Ocean. And there has been a definite push in India to modernize the Navy. India has approached the United States in the past to develop a nuclear submarine. We haven't got it. India approached the French for it. We didn't get that. But the Indian R&D department, the defense R&D, is very nearly on a breakthrough to be able to make a nuclear submarine of its own. In fact, we already have SSBNs, Indian-made, absolutely indigenous, own technology SSBNs. We are looking for SSNs. But as of now, we still take it on lease from Russia. But as I said, likewise with tanks, likewise with aircraft, the next SSN is not going to be a leased Russian one. The next SSN is either going to be an indigenous Indian one, or something like the AUKUS agreement. It could be based on some kind of Western technology. So it's the Navy that we are looking to modernize now.
How long do we have another? We have
30 minutes.
We have 30 minutes more, good. Because I've got questions coming up. Before I go to you, Bob, I want to throw this to you, Joe, based on several questions that came in about the possibility of war with China over Taiwan. And I want to phrase this in a way that we've already, in your longer presentation that I was privileged to read, you talk about the massive economic consequences. And this raises one of those great paradoxical questions. You know, the United States has not in its history had an enemy who also was its largest trading partner. That's Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, right? These were not integrated within the United States economy. Does the fact that, so this is a two-part question, does the fact that the cost of a war would be so bad, so heavy, so dangerous for both the Chinese and the United States, does that act as a deterrent on either side? That's question one. Related to that, though, is we have, because of the rising tension, there is a rising desire in the part of the United States, a lot of strategic thinkers in the United States. We should be decoupling our economy from that of China, which makes a certain degree of national security sense. But I'm worried about if the fact that we are connected to each other acts as a deterrent to war, would decoupling make war more likely? What do you think, Joe?
I appreciate that question. So yeah, this is probably really the crux of a lot of the research I've been focused on. And the first part, the cost of war for both parties if it happened today. Conflict over Taiwan, a blockade of Taiwan, hit hard, they hit fast. So we're talking immediately in the first year about $1 trillion total impact. Lost revenue from TSMC and the major semiconductor entities is about $1.6 trillion. The U.S. GDP, I might have mentioned this earlier, is expected to drop about 6 to 10%. You think about what that does to our consumer price index, and you know, in the first half of 2022, our U.S. GDP dropped cumulatively about 2%. Well, that impacted the cost of groceries, in part, contributed to the rising cost of gasoline for Americans at the pump. There's a lot of this ties, I think, back into political capital as well. Could we bear those costs?
Yeah.
There's certainly going to be increased costs. In the case of a conflict with Taiwan, I would say that the energy costs of energy utilities, if you pull up Fred during that period of time, would be substantially higher than what we saw in 2022. China's GDP, though, would probably take a roughly 30%-ish plus hit in the first year. And you just look at the state of their economy today and their population today, could they weather that cost? And I think that's got to factor in to some degree in the decision calculus of policymakers on both sides. So I would say, you know, the first one, the cost of the war, is absolutely a deterrent. I don't think they really want it. And to some degree, although China has given this mixed messages in the past, I think at the 20th Party Congress, President Xi was being somewhat sincere when he said hey, China is committed to a peaceful reunification with Taiwan. I think the second question, the decoupling, is interesting. And totally am aligned with that logic. I think the more interconnected we can be in a free and prosperous world with multinational partners, preserving a free and open Indo-Pacific, but even globally, brings, I'd like to believe, more opportunities for peace and prevention of escalations than it creates problems. And so if you're entirely decoupled from an entity that doesn't have a mutually vested interest in your prosperity, then by that logic, you would say, sure, the chances of escalation could be equally as high. You know, I also think that if we look back over the last year or two, from putting the business hat back on, the unilateral expropriations that China has imposed across certain sectors, especially their state-owned enterprises and high tech, that have come back and hurt U.S. businesses and U.S. investors in America, substantially hurt U.S. investors in America without any recourse on our side, because we are in some ways decoupled. We took certain stances for the opposite reason, to protect U.S. businesses and investors, was the logic of that time, and removed ourselves from certain forums that I think some would argue, and I might offer, also simultaneously present an opportunity in binding regulations and trade agreements to almost hold China's feet to the fire, where they are mutually interested in investment. Oh, by the way, not just China and the United States, but partners and allies that are also members of those organizations, where a path towards mutual prosperity and some mutual dependency on the well-being of each other, I think presents more roads to peace than it does to war.
I have a question about that. Two thoughts. Norman Angell wrote a book around 1910. Korean countries were so interconnected economically, war was impossible. That was the 1910s. Back Jane, he was proved wrong. But in fact, that was the precursor, on a smaller degree, but still quite significant, of interconnected economics. So that makes me doubt a little bit. Interconnected economics was peaceful. Second thought is this. Americans think in economic terms. The motivation for people is economic. For example, our conflict of interest laws are all about money. But other conflicts of interest, partly because we can measure it, partly because that's the thing. In general, we think people come to America because they want to get rich. We think if you're successful in America, it's measurable by how much money is in your bank account. There are countries in the world, and places in the world, they don't really think that way. You know, money's less important. Money's less important than many Americans too, who are quite comfortable wherever they are, and they don't want to get rich. They're fine the way they are. If tomorrow is as good as today, no worse, that's terrific. I wonder whether we unconsciously overemphasize economic factors. My instinct is that if people go to war, they say they're going for it. I'm not so sure. You know, I was in Japan a couple of years ago. The Imperial War Museum. Well, it's the British name. But anyway, it's the memorial from your point of view, the second. Perfectly clear. One of the reasons, main reason, Japan was so upset with what was going on. Sure, we were squeezing them economically. They felt a racist thing. They felt there was a racist attitude toward them. They were looked down upon. Psychology, more important thing, part of it. Indeed, when they were destroyed economically during the Second World War, they still fought on. Honor demanded these never. So I just wonder whether the economic part really obviously has some weight, but I think that we tend to overemphasize it.
I would, and I will, for the audience online, to our previous question is, do we place too much faith in the power of economics to either keep the peace or explain going to war? What do we do with those non-economic elements? And since the three of you have taken theories of war and strategy, and you've read about the Peloponnesian War, I have a vested interest here because I'm the course director for theories of war and strategy. I want to pose that question to the three of you. When you think about the reasons why states go to war, it's a little bit like, we're talking about a few kilometers in the Himalayas, right? They don't look like a whole lot on the map, but they might matter a great deal for what they represent. That there's money, but there's also national prestige, right? The Chinese talk about, ending a century of humiliation, right? That's almost more important than, that making the money is just the proof of their success, and that if money is not going to necessarily salve all their wounds. And similarly, for going back to the question I asked you, Chris, about we may value market-based economic structures, but when it comes right down to it, right, issues of national security, national survival, national prestige, they might not just have a price tag. And so, studying enough wars, you realize people go to wars for all kinds of reasons, and very few of them are really very good or very good and very rationally decide to sacrifice a generation. And yet, people go to war anyway. So, for the three of you, right, what kinds of factors go into war, and how does that make you look at the different crises and different problems that you are studying and that you are thinking about? What is the interplay between material factors, material interests, and non-material, let's say irrational, because, but let's say irrational. I'm going to throw that to the three of you, and I'll, first one to want to jump in can answer.
I will tackle this question from an India-China perspective.
Sure.
I mean, I could have answered it purely from a theoretical perspective also, but I think it will be easier for me also to relate it to the ongoing competition and conflict between these two countries. Likewise, it's something similar for what Sir, the question that Sir put with respect to U.S. and China. Now, like for U.S. and China, India and China are the second for India, China the second largest trading partner of after the U.S. It has been the largest trading partner also in the past and for decades. So there is a very strong economic kind of an angle between India and China. Now, however, despite that, when these border incursions started happening from 2013 onwards, 2013 was the first time that after 62 there was a border incursion. Not violent, it was a face-off, and these face-offs became increasingly frequent. And as I said, the reason was not territory. It was not exactly territory. As you said, it was hitting at the Indian national prestige, because there's an incursion, it comes in the media, and there's an uproar all over the country. So it's to keep a handle on the Indian pulse. That's what China has been doing. So now for several years, India refrained from taking this activity in the military domain towards the economic domain. But when 2020 happened, when people got killed, first, what India did is that there was billions of dollars of investment of Huawei and ZTE to develop 5G technology in India, because India was turning 5G. India banned all immediately, with immediate effect. The entire investment in India was returned. The companies were told to vacate India overnight.
Really?
That's a great step. And there was no unlike we spoke about legislations for the land issues which Chris spoke about. There was no debate on this between the parties. It was a unanimous decision overnight. Just the cabinet just announced that there was already work going on. There was already towers being installed. Everything will stop. Everything will be dismantled. The companies will be told to go back. They will be compensated. They were compensated for whatever had happened till then, and they were told to go back. 2 days later, 126 apps which had presence on Google Play, Android, as well as what's it called, iOS, in India were banned. Any app with a Chinese background was banned by India, by the government of India. So, and the reason for whatever little opposition to it was because a lot of Indians were hooked onto these Chinese apps and Chinese games. Even these innocent, these games like what the children play. multi-party games, even those were all banned. They said there will be no revenue which will go from Indian pockets to the Chinese companies. But at the same time, despite those bans, India and China still remain the second largest trading partner, because there are many other commodities like food and energy and iron ore and all that, where you simply cannot hit the reset button. So while when dealing with such like situations, the economic angle has to be looked in a very contextualized manner by countries. Where there is threat of the nature of the security kind there, and 5G was a definite threat, about which India was cognizant. But at the same time, India wanted to speed up its 5G transition, and therefore it had the Indian companies had contracted with the Chinese. And what has happened is that after the Chinese have gone, the Indian companies have stood up to this challenge, and the targets for 5G transition are still being met. India is going to be completely 5G reliant by 2025, despite the Chinese not being there. So it's an incentive for the Indian technology and the Indian companies to step in and kind of offset the damage which was done because of those decisions which the government has taken. So what I'm trying to say is that I think it's still possible for the economic pushback in certain strategic sectors, like the U.S. has done in terms of chips and science. We were speaking while we were coming here. It's a great step that has been taken. It has to be taken to a logical kind of a conclusion. So I think that besides the security factors and the economic factors, which are intermeshed with each other, both these factors, and the third factor, of course, is the people-to-people contact. Over the years, the Indian people there's a lot of people exchange, a lot of Indian students going to study in Chinese university. Over the past 10, 12 years, it's fallen drastically. I guess there are hardly, when COVID happened, there were barely about 2,500 students in China. Compare that to more than 600,000 students of India who are studying in the United States. And 15 years back, a huge number of 20 years back, a huge number of Indian students used to be going to China. There was a lot of Chinese presence in terms of tourism in India. All that has really been greatly impacted by the happenings in the past. So I guess these all factors play up together, and they are all kind of interlinked, and that's how conflict and competition and cooperation that continuum between two nations is going to play out. So you want to jump on that?
Absolutely. Well, sir, you said at the beginning of this panel, you gave our core college motto by our founder, and it's not to promote war, it is to preserve peace. I think a variety of things and mechanisms can be used for good or for evil, for peace or for war. It's difficult to prove a counterfactual, Bob. You know, it was a very good question about Europe and what ultimately happened and why we went to war. But we don't know how much worse the war might have been, or the reconstruction coming out of the war might have been if it wasn't as interconnected as it was. And so, while I certainly understand and respect that question, because we see interconnected rivals, just take from the U.S. perspective, we're taught to be strategically empathetic and consider the viewpoints of other countries and nations as well. But from the U.S. perspective for a moment, you know, we look at what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, and every day in the news, there was another one yesterday morning where China is now suggesting that they will provide Russia with conventional weapons to launch more offensives and take more land territory in Ukraine. Wang has been there. They're talking about President Xi potentially going to Moscow soon. And so that's the type of interconnectedness that some might perceive as being hostile and making war, conflict. On the other hand, a recent news report came out and shared that France and Germany have offered to throw their hats in the ring as well. Now, while not suggesting to provide Ukraine with full NATO membership, in the event at some point that we come to a peaceful ceasefire and Russia launches another offensive at some point down the road in the future, that they would be willing to help provide arms and support of a defensive nature to help repel that aggression. I would say that's an example of interconnectedness that is based more on peace and defensibility. It's difficult to know. I can tell you that personally, growing up in a household where my mother grew up in South Korea was wonderful. And the story she was able to tell as I got a little older around the bad men from the north when she was a young girl coming south, and what it was like for her immediate family not being in the Tucson perimeter and the things that she saw was pretty tough. She has vague recollections, and thankfully, in some ways, maybe she was a little bit older to remember them in detail. So things can be tough, and sometimes you have leaders in countries, like on that peninsula, that are irrational leaders. On the other hand, she'll tell you that her grandmother would never even look a Japanese national in the eye. But now you look at the amount of trade between South Korea and Japan and the relationship they have today. I would offer that as yet another example of interconnectedness that has played out well, and both are strategically important partners for the United States, specifically, again, going back into the Indo-Pacific. So I don't know, maybe I've become more a bit of a pacifist or optimist as I've gotten a little older, but I think that, and I think being interconnected in many ways helps you understand perhaps a little bit better and empathetically what your quote unquote adversaries are doing. And in some ways, and this is maybe the intelligence side of me, got to keep an eye on them a little bit more closely, but then also offer some pathways to peace.
In fact, being an intelligence officer, right, the more you know is generally considered the better if you're in the intelligence. Right? Chris, what do you think?
Just so I'm going to get you excited. I know the basis of your question here. You're wanting to talk about Thucydides, so I'll throw a couple things.
Guilty as charged.
Yeah. So there's this continual perception, right, of the status quo power, Sparta in the case of ancient Greece, and the up and coming power Athens in the case of. So we naturally start to, and we even see this really in our systems and in our news media. We start to talk about and think about, hey, what are our vital national interests? So oftentimes within that context, we're talking about things, systems of governance. And so what you're seeing in the news, and even the questions today are about forms of government between a free and open economy, a democratic republic, and an autocracy, and the strengths and differences of those. That's a way to drive a wedge between governments. We talk about economics. Obviously, there's been significant discussion about that. Our way of exercising economics within these two different systems of governance. Culture, something significantly different from Sparta and Athens and yesteryear to now with the differences in culture between the United States and China. And then you have security. Obviously, that's another concern, and that's been really the genesis of today's discussion. And a lot of us, on the basis of national security, have deployed, after 9/11, a lot of us have a very real experience as a consequence of security concerns. And so what I would say is that we have to determine, hey, going into this eyes wide open, what are our national security and what are those vital national security interests that make us move along the conflict continuum to breach conflict. And frankly, the one thing that I've been sitting here kind of contemplating, especially as a tool's been discussing, is what are the consequences of our partners and allies in all of this? Because oftentimes we see this as a dual us versus them sort of a scenario. And I could imagine with India's growth in power, they're sitting back looking, and they're neutral. The way they approach is bilateral and such. And I could see the perception forming that anytime another superpower starts to encroach upon the United States platform, well, all of a sudden we start talking about competitors, and competitors starts into discussions about adversaries. And so those are the concerns that I have. We have really intricate agreements, both the United States and China. I'll tell you, just looking at Australia, for example, we have a security pact with China, but China has a extreme economic reliance on China. And so if we start talking about these sorts of issues along the conflict continuum, which direction is Australia willing to go? Is it to afford their economy an absolute, essentially, divestiture and implosion? or do they go with their security partner in the United States? So we have to look much further beyond that. We have in our War College classes and our seminars, we have 16 personnel. We get together every day. Within our groups, we have 4 international partners. And Joe and my group, we have a partner from the Philippines, from Tunisia, from Mexico, and then and Greece. Oddly enough.
Did he find Thucydides interesting?
Oh, gosh. He was posting his own stuff on the board. But the interesting thing that the Tunisian student asked us one time in open class is, hey, you have these similar differences with Saudi Arabia, and yet you engage pretty extensively in defense operations with them. And so it looks, looking at it from an allied perspective, there's some hypocrisy as we start to navigate these things, and we have to be mindful of that, I think, in whatever endeavor we decide to take on. So those would be my comments.
I like that. Well, and the complexity is crucial, right? And since you mentioned Thucydides first, now I can. But one of the things that comes up in Thucydides is the idea that states act based on a combination of fear, honor, and interest, right? So interest, the material questions, economic questions are there, but the fear and honor, right? And these are translated differently in different versions of Thucydides. But fear is, sort of concerns about your rivals, right? Your sort of reaction to them, like, are they encroaching on your territory? Are they threatening to eclipse you? And honor is, these are both non-material concepts, right? They are just as important, or can be just as important as interest in making that decision. Because one could see that if you were just doing the calculation, right, who would go to war if they had to calculate how much it was going to cost? In fact, most of the time, when states go to war, they go out of their way to tell their people, right, this is bigger than making money, right? And so what they're saying is that we know it's going to be terribly expensive, but we still think we need to do it. Usually they frame it in terms of fear and honor. But that's one of those issues. Also, when we think about, it's the purpose of this panel, we're getting close to the end here, but as we think about this panel as about future national security challenges, right? That is the question. How do we define those challenges? Challenges, the world's going to be more complicated. Well, I got bad news for you, right? The world's going to get more complicated no matter what, and so you have to decide how you're going to deal with it. And how do you view complexity as a threat? Do you view complexity as an opportunity? That is a matter of that's built on a sense of, let's say, national confidence that you know what you would like to have happen. Right? So if you feel confident in your strength to accomplish your national goals, you're not going to be scared. You'll be prepared. Right? In other words, right, you're not going to lash out. But that gets back to the question of whether individual players in the international arena, whether they have they thought strategically enough to be prepared for what they expect to have happen, what they want to see in the future.
I knew that'd get you fired up.
I knew that. I waited all the way to the end. But I want to give each of you, we have about 5 minutes, and I want to give each of you a chance. If there's anything that you haven't had a chance to say that you want to say to our audience, we'll reverse order here. Chris, I'm going to start with you. Just as long as it's not Go Chiefs.
I know better than that. Especially, we're going to really elevate that conflict continuum if I do something like that. No, I just want to say thank you very much. A very inquisitive group. It's been a pleasure. We visited Princeton yesterday. We're headed down to Swarthmore later this afternoon, and we've had a whole host of questions. And what I'll tell you, I'll leave you with is that there's generational discussions, right? We're of a particular generation. I see some different generations in the room. We've spoken to different generations over the last couple of days. I'm very, very excited about the type of students that we've encountered. We're out talking with international affairs students. A lot of them have more extensive questions that we could ever answer, and it's really a bright future. I mean, oftentimes we talk about kind of the dark side when we're in uniform. It's a lot about national security and operations in war and such. But I have a lot of hope for our future, despite what you might hear out in the news media. And again, I'm very thankful for have been being hosted by FPRI in Philadelphia. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Joe?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll echo Chris's sentiments. Pleasure to be here today at FPRI and in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. And I think that, to your final question there, Dr. Granieri, I think, that interconnectedness comes with complexity. And, in the business world, as you were talking about that, for some reason, Porter's Five Forces model popped up in my head, and I actually drew it on my whiteboard in my last battalion command with a bunch of Army reservists who were looking at me like I was crazy. But part of that model talks about not only your competition and what your competitors are doing, but what opportunities you might have leveraging the arms of others and capabilities of potential supporters and allies. And so I think that I believe the world is full of opportunity if we find the right forms and mechanisms to leverage that and bring it together. But what a treat today. Thanks so much for hosting us. Great to see you.
Thank you so much. I share the sentiment of my friends here. And in addition to that, I would also like to talk about my own experience being in the United States, coming from a half a world away. I'll talk about my children. My daughter, who's just turned 21, 4 years back, she came up to me and said that she wanted to study in the United States. My immediate response was no. I don't know where the United States is. I have no idea. I mean, I had no idea that I would be coming here 4 years later, but I had never even thought of, or anyone in my family had even thought of having a child, any of our children studying in the United States. Eventually, I gave in because she was relentless. She came in and she has finished her undergrad here. And my elder one, the son, he after a couple of years, he also decided that he wants to do his grad in the U.S. And he came along with us last year. It's been an out of the world experience for us being in the United States. The interactions I've had with the officers of the United States, even my foreign compatriots who have come from different countries. It's been I think it's been a life-changing year for me personally. And talking at a country-to-country level, if I were to look at 2010, that was the time I was commanding my battalion, my armored battalion. It is the T-72 battalion, as I said. And that's also the time that India, for the first time, contracted the C-130s, and that was amongst the first big purchases, defense purchases by India. Who would have imagined? I would not have imagined that time that in another 10 years we would have bought, or we were going to buy C-17 Globemasters from you, the Apaches, the Chinooks, the Reapers now, and leave aside the defense, economy. The economy trade between India and US has grown to such levels that over the past 5 years, 4 out of the 5 years, India and US, for India, I mean not for the US, but for India, the United States has been the biggest trading partner. The trade exceeding on an average $110 billion. The yearly trade has increased, has gone to $110 billion. So all these events over the past 8, 9, 10 years only indicate, I think they're indicative of a much stronger and a brighter relationship between two of the largest and greatest democracies of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Atul. Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of this program. I want to thank all of you who tuned in online, especially those of you who stayed all the way to the end, as well as those of you who are here in the brand new offices of FPRI on Broad Street in Philadelphia. I hope that while we figure out the best ways to do these kinds of events and we deal with various technical issues, that you will stay with us. We hope that you enjoyed this conversation. We look forward to welcoming you next time. We encourage you, if you are a member or partner of FPRI, we thank you for the support that makes events like this possible. If, as a guest, you are not yet a member or partner of FPRI, allow me to take this moment to say this would be a great time for you to consider the possibility of becoming a member or partner of FPRI so that you can contribute to these events. If you want to know more about events at FPRI, please visit our website, fpri.org, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, join us next time for our next event. But until next time, for my friends from the Army War College, for FPRI, for everybody here in Philadelphia, I'm Ron Graneri. Thanks for joining.